The key wouldn't turn. I stood there on my childhood porch, still wearing my funeral dress, mascara streaks dried on my cheeks, jiggling the brass key that had worked perfectly fine when I'd left that morning. The lock felt different under my fingers, newer, shinier. Wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I pressed my forehead against the familiar red door, exhaustion weighing down every bone in my body. It had been the longest day of my life. Watching them lower Marcus into the ground, accepting condolences from people who barely knew him, pretending to be strong when all I wanted was to collapse. All I'd wanted was to come home, crawl into bed, and maybe find some piece of him still lingering in our old room. Our old room. The room where we'd spent our last 3 months together when the medical bills forced us to move back in with my parents. The room where Marcus had whispered jokes to distract me from the sound of his oxygen machine. The room where I'd held his hand through those final nights, promising him I'd be okay even though we both knew I was lying. I tried the key again, twisting it harder this time, willing it to work through sheer desperation. Nothing. The mechanism was completely different. I fumbled for my phone and called Mom, but it went straight to voicemail. Dad's phone did the same thing. Panic started creeping up my throat as I realized the truth I didn't want to accept. They'd changed the locks. While I was burying my husband. While I was standing graveside throwing dirt onto the casket of the only person who'd ever understood me, they were at Home Depot getting new hardware installed. I walked around to the backyard, hoping maybe the patio door was unlocked, and that's when I saw him. My younger brother Jake hefting boxes up the back steps. Boxes I recognized. My boxes. Our boxes. The few possessions Marcus and I had managed to keep when we'd had to sell everything else to pay for his treatments. Jake, I called out, my voice hoarse from crying. What are you doing with my things? He looked up, startled, nearly dropping the box labeled wedding photos in his thick black marker handwriting. For a second, his face showed something that might have been guilt, but it quickly shifted to that defensive expression he'd perfected as a teenager whenever he got caught doing something he knew was wrong. Oh hey, Sophia, you're back early. He set the box down carefully on the patio table, avoiding my eyes. How was the... The thing. The thing. My husband's funeral was the thing to him. I stared at my 26-year-old brother, this man-child who'd never held a job for more than 6 months, who still asked Mom to do his laundry, who'd spent the last year complaining that having me and Marcus in the house cramped his style when he brought dates over. Why do you have my things, Jake? And why won't my key work? He shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the house like he was hoping for backup. Look, Mom and Dad are going to explain everything when they get back from the lawyers. They had to go handle some paperwork stuff about the house and Marcus's situation. Marcus's situation. Death was apparently too harsh a word for Jake's delicate vocabulary. I felt something cold settle in my stomach, a dread that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with betrayal. Where are they putting my things, Jake? Well, see, that's the thing. He ran his hand through his hair, a nervous habit he'd had since childhood. Emma's pregnant. Emma. His girlfriend of 8 months, who worked at the tanning salon and collected inspirational quotes on Pinterest. I blinked at him, trying to process how this information connected to my belongings being in boxes on the patio. Congratulations, I said slowly, but I don't understand what that has to do with my room. It's not really your room anymore though, is it? The words came out in a rush, like he'd been practicing them. I mean, with Marcus gone and everything, you don't really need all that space. And Emma's been staying over more, and now with the baby coming, we really need our own place. But apartments are super expensive right now, and Mom thought what? My voice was deadly quiet. Jake looked genuinely uncomfortable now, shuffling his feet like he was still 15 years old getting lectured about his grades. She thought maybe you could take the sunroom for a while. Just until you figure out your next steps. It's got great natural light, and you always liked plants and stuff. The sunroom. The glorified porch where Mom stored her craft supplies and Dad kept his exercise bike that he never used. They wanted to move me into storage space so Jake and his pregnant girlfriend could have the actual bedroom. The bedroom where I'd nursed my dying husband. The bedroom where his scent still lingered on the pillows. They changed the locks while I was at Marcus's funeral so you could move into my room. It wasn't a question. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. The timing wasn't coincidental. They'd planned this. While I was saying goodbye to the love of my life, my family was erasing me from their home. Mom said it would be easier this way, Jake mumbled. Like, less emotional or whatever. She was worried you'd get all upset and make a scene. A scene. Objecting to being displaced hours after becoming a widow was making a scene. I looked at this boy I'd once protected from bullies, whose homework I'd helped with, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged when Mom was too busy with her book club meetings. This selfish stranger wearing my brother's face. Where's Emma now? I asked. Inside. Measuring the windows for new curtains. She wants to do like a whole nursery theme. Gender-neutral yellow since we don't know if it's a boy or girl yet. He was getting excited now, apparently forgetting that he was talking to someone whose world had just ended. She's got all these ideas from Pinterest about organization and making the most of small spaces. Small spaces. My grief was a small space they needed to reorganize. I walked past him toward the back door, but he caught my arm. Sophia, wait. Mom said to tell you they'll be back around 6 with dinner. Chinese food from that place you like. And she got you some of those sleeping pills from Dr. Chen. She thought you might need help, adjusting. Adjusting. Sleeping pills to keep me compliant while they redistributed my life. I pulled free from his grip and tried the back door. Locked, of course. But through the glass, I could see her. Emma, barely showing at what couldn't be more than 12 weeks pregnant, standing in my bedroom with a measuring tape and a notebook. My wedding photo was already gone from the dresser. Marcus's reading chair, the leather one his father had given us, was pushed into the corner like an afterthought. She looked up and saw me through the glass, waved cheerfully like this was the most normal thing in the world. Like she hadn't just moved into a dead man's room while his widow stood locked outside. I stepped back, my mind reeling. 3 months ago, I'd been a married woman with my own apartment, my own life, my own future. Then Marcus got sick, and we'd lost the apartment. 2 months ago, I'd been a caregiver, spending every moment focused on treatments and hope, and making the most of whatever time we had left. Last month, I'd been planning a funeral while trying to figure out how to exist without him. And now, apparently, I was homeless. The sunroom really isn't that bad, Jake said, following me as I walked back to the patio. And it's just temporary. Mom thinks maybe you could get a job at the school district. They're always looking for substitute teachers. And you've got that English degree. A substitute teacher. My master's degree in literature, which I'd put on hold to care for Marcus, reduced to day-to-day classroom babysitting. My marriage, which had been the center of my world for 6 years, treated like a minor inconvenience now that it was over. I sat down heavily in one of the patio chairs, the same chairs where Marcus and I used to have coffee in the mornings when he was having good days. The same table where he'd done his crossword puzzles, determined to keep his mind sharp even as his body failed him. They planned this, I said, more to myself than to Jake. What? They planned this. The locks, the boxes, Emma measuring for curtains. This didn't happen in the 4 hours I was at the funeral. They've been planning this. Jake had the grace to look ashamed. Mom mentioned it last week, about the room situation, but she said we'd wait until after today. I guess she thought it would be better to just get it done. Better? Like ripping off a bandage. Like my grief was something to be managed and minimized rather than honored. I thought about Marcus, about how he'd worried in those final weeks about leaving me with my family. They mean well, he'd said, but they don't understand love like ours. He'd been right, as always. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the yard where I'd played as a child, where Marcus had proposed on Christmas morning 3 years ago. I looked at my brother, this person who shared my DNA but apparently none of my capacity for empathy, and realized something that should have broken my heart, but instead felt oddly liberating. I was truly alone now. But maybe that was better than being surrounded by people who saw my love as an inconvenience and my grief as a problem to be solved. I was still sitting in the patio chair when my parents returned, their voices drifting through the evening air before I saw them. Mom was laughing at something Dad had said, the kind of carefree sound I hadn't heard from her in months. The sound stopped abruptly when they rounded the corner and found me waiting in their backyard like some unwelcome visitor. "Sophia, sweetheart," Mom said, her voice immediately shifting to that overly gentle tone she used when she thought I might break. "You're back. How are you holding up?" I held up the useless key. "My key doesn't work." Dad cleared his throat, setting down the bags of Chinese takeout on the patio table next to my boxed belongings. "We can explain that. Why don't we go inside and talk properly?" "I can't go inside. The locks are changed." "That's what we need to talk about." Mom and Dad exchanged a look, one of those married couple communications that happen without words. Mom sighed and pulled out a chair across from me while Dad remained standing, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "We thought it would be easier this way," Mom began. "Today was already so difficult, and we didn't want to add to your stress with complicated discussions about living arrangements. Complicated discussions. As if my right to live in my childhood home was some complex negotiation rather than basic human decency. So you decided to lock me out while I was burying Marcus." "That's not how we saw it," Dad said quickly. "We saw it as handling the practical matters so you wouldn't have to worry about them. Jake told you about Emma's situation, right? The pregnancy?" The way he said situation made it sound like an emergency rather than a planned pregnancy. I looked between my parents, these people who'd raised me, who'd taught me about right and wrong, who'd attended my wedding and promised Marcus they'd take care of me if anything happened to him. "You promised him," I said quietly, "at the hospital, when he asked if I'd have somewhere to go. You promised you'd take care of me." Mom's face softened, and for a moment I thought maybe she understood. "And we are taking care of you, honey. The sunroom will be perfect for you. Quiet, private, lots of space for your things. My things are in boxes on your patio. Temporarily," Dad said firmly, "until we can get some proper storage solutions in the sunroom." Emma found some great organizational ideas online. Very efficient use of space. Emma again. Everything came back to Emma and her Pinterest boards and her 8-month relationship with my useless brother. I thought about Marcus's proposal, how he'd spent weeks planning it, how he'd asked my parents for permission even though we were both adults, the respect he'd shown them, the way he'd integrated himself into our family dinners and holiday traditions. "Did Emma know?" I asked. "Know what?" Mom looked genuinely confused. "Did she know you were doing this today, while I was at the funeral?" Another exchanged look between my parents. Dad shifted uncomfortably. "She might have mentioned that today would be a good day to get the room organized." Practical girl, Emma. Very forward-thinking. Forward-thinking. She'd planned around my husband's funeral like it was a convenient scheduling opportunity. I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest, different from grief, harder than sadness. "Where is she now?" "Getting some rest," Mom said. "Pregnancy is exhausting, especially in the first trimester. She's been feeling nauseous, and all the excitement of setting up the nursery wore her out." "The nursery?" "In the room where Marcus had died. Where his last coherent words had been whispered to me in the dark. Where I'd promised him I'd keep his memory alive, that I'd never let anyone forget how deeply he'd loved life even as it was ending." "What did you do with his things?" I asked. Dad looked confused. "What things?" "Marcus's things. His books, his clothes, his medication organizer, the humidifier Dr. Rodriguez said he needed. What did you do with them?" Mom and Dad exchanged another look, this one longer and more uncomfortable. "We donated most of it," Mom said finally. "The clothes went to Goodwill. The medical equipment went back to the rental company. We thought it would be too painful for you to see them every day." "You donated his books?" "They were mostly philosophy and poetry," Dad said with a dismissive wave. "Not really practical for everyday reading. We kept a few of the nicer ones, the leather-bound classics. They're in the living room bookshelf now. Display books. Marcus's beloved, annotated, dog-eared philosophy texts. had been reduced to interior decorating. The margins where he'd written his thoughts, the pages he'd turned to when he needed comfort, all of it gone to strangers who'd probably throw them away. "You had no right," I said, but my voice came out weak, defeated. "We had every right," Dad said, his tone sharpening. "This is our house, Sophia. We've been generous letting you stay here rent-free for 3 months while you figured things out. But Jake is our son too, and he's starting a family. That takes priority." Priority. My dead husband ranked lower than my brother's accidental pregnancy. I looked at these people who'd raised me and wondered when they'd become strangers. Or maybe they'd always been strangers, and I'd just been too naive to see it. "Did you even wait until after the service?" I asked. "Wait for what?" Mom looked genuinely puzzled. "To start packing his things, to change the locks, to move Emma in." "Did you at least wait until after we'd buried him?" The silence stretched too long. Dad cleared his throat. "The locksmith could only come this morning," he said finally. "And Emma had the day off work. It seemed efficient to handle everything at once." Efficient. While I was standing at the graveside, listening to the pastor read scripture Marcus had chosen, they were here, erasing him from existence. While I was accepting condolences from his coworkers and his college friends, Emma was measuring windows for nursery curtains in the room where he'd drawn his last breath. "I want to see the sunroom," I said. Mom's relief was visible. "Of course, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. We've already moved most of your essential items in there." She led me through the house, chattering about the improvements they'd made. New paint in the hallway, updated light fixtures in the kitchen, a fresh coat of stain on the hardwood floors. Everything looked pristine, unmarked by tragedy or loss. No sign that death had ever visited this house. The sunroom was worse than I'd imagined. My clothes were crammed into a narrow wardrobe that looked like it belonged in a college dorm. My bed was a twin-size mattress on a metal frame, pushed against the windows. The desk where Marcus used to write in his journal was shoved into the corner, covered with gardening supplies that Mom apparently hadn't bothered to relocate. "It's cozy," Mom said brightly. "And look, we got you these lovely new curtains." Emma picked them out. She has such good taste. The curtains were yellow, a cheerful sunflower pattern that belonged in a child's bedroom, nothing like the deep blue ones Marcus and I had chosen for our apartment, the ones that blocked out the morning light so he could sleep late during his bad days. "Where's his journal?" I asked. Mom looked blank. "Whose journal?" "Marcus kept a journal, leather-bound about this big." I showed her with my hands. He wrote in it every day, even when he could barely hold a pen. "Where is it?" "Oh, that old notebook? I think it went to Goodwill with the other papers." "Emma thought it might be too sad for you to keep." Emma thought. Emma decided. Emma, who'd never spoken more than 20 words to Marcus in the entire time she'd known him, had apparently been making decisions about his belongings, about what I could and couldn't handle in my own grief. I sat down heavily on the child-sized bed, the springs creaking under my weight. Through the windows, I could see into what used to be my bedroom. Emma was awake now, moving around in there, hanging something on the walls. Baby-themed decorations, probably, erasing the last traces of the life Marcus and I had built. "This is temporary," Mom said again, sitting beside me. "Just until you get back on your feet. Maybe take some time to think about what you want to do next. There's no rush." But there was a rush. There was Emma's pregnancy timeline, and Jake's need for space, and the family's need to move forward without the inconvenience of my grief. I was being managed, handled, efficiently processed like one of Dad's work projects. "I want to call the Goodwill," I said, "to see if they still have his things." "Sophia, honey," Mom's voice took on that patronizing tone again. "It's been 3 months since we donated those items. And honestly, holding on to those things isn't healthy. Dr. Patterson says that removing triggers can help with the healing process." Dr. Patterson. Their family physician, who'd prescribed sleeping pills and antidepressants like they were vitamins, who'd never met Marcus, never seen us together, Never understood that some people actually do find their soulmates at 25 and build real, lasting love. I didn't ask Dr. Patterson to dispose of my husband's belongings. No, but we're your family. We know what's best for you right now. You're not thinking clearly, which is completely understandable. Grief affects judgment. That's why people have families, to make the hard decisions when they can't. Hard decisions. Like whether I deserve to keep my dead husband's journal. Like whether his philosophy books were worth shelf space. Like whether I merited a real bedroom, or just storage space with windows. I stood up, my legs unsteady. I need some air. Of course. Why don't you rest and we'll talk more tomorrow? Everything will seem clearer after a good night's sleep. But as I walked back through the house, past the erased hallways and the renovated kitchen, past the living room where Marcus's books sat like props on the shelf, I knew that nothing would be clearer tomorrow. My family had made their choice, and it wasn't me. I didn't sleep that night. How could I, lying on a child's bed in what used to be my mother's craft room, listening to my brother and his girlfriend giggle through the thin walls as they christened my former bedroom? Every creak of the bed frame, every whispered conversation about baby names and wedding plans felt like another nail in the coffin of my old life. At 3 a.m, I gave up trying to rest and walked to the kitchen for water. The house felt different in the darkness, sterile and unwelcoming. I was tiptoeing past the living room when I saw them there on the bookshelf, Marcus's philosophy books lined up like trophies. I pulled down his copy of Camus, the one he'd read to me during his chemo sessions when I couldn't sleep. The margins were filled with his handwriting, his thoughts on mortality and meaning, and the absurdity of suffering. Couldn't sleep either? I spun around to find Emma standing in the doorway, wearing one of Jake's old t-shirts and a pair of boxer shorts. Her hand rested protectively over her barely visible bump, and her hair was tousled from whatever activities had kept them awake. Just getting some water, I said, clutching Marcus's book to my chest. She padded into the kitchen, opening cupboards like she already lived here permanently. Jake told me about Marcus. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. About how much you loved him. It must be really hard. Must be. Like, my grief was theoretical, something she'd read about but never experienced. I watched her pour herself a glass of milk, comfortable and confident in what she clearly considered her new home. This was his favorite book, I said, holding up the Camus. Emma glanced at it dismissively. Philosophy, right? Jake says you're really smart, college-educated and everything. That's cool. She leaned against the counter, studying me like I was some exotic creature. Your mom says you're having trouble adjusting. That's totally normal. My cousin went through the same thing when her boyfriend died in that motorcycle accident. Her boyfriend. Marcus and I had been married for 3 years, together for 6, and she was comparing him to some cousin's casual relationship. I felt something snap inside me, a cord that had been stretched too tight for too long. He wasn't my boyfriend. He was my husband. Right, sorry. Husband. She waved her hand like the distinction was meaningless. Anyway, what I'm saying is, you'll bounce back. You're still young. You're pretty when you fix yourself up. There are tons of great guys out there once you're ready to start looking. Start looking. As if Marcus was a lost pet I needed to replace. As if love was interchangeable, generic, something you could pick up at the store when you ran out. I'm not looking for anyone else. Emma's face scrunched up in confusion. But you can't stay single forever. That's not healthy. Jake's friend Tyler just got divorced, and he's actually really sweet once you get to know him. Great job, good with kids. I could introduce you guys once you're feeling better. Tyler. She was already planning my romantic future, 12 hours after I had buried my husband. I stared at this girl, this child who thought pregnancy made her wise and 8 months of dating made her an expert on love. Does it bother you at all? I asked quietly. Does what bother me? Sleeping in the room where he died, where I held his hand while he took his last breath, where I promised him I'd never forget him. For the first time, Emma looked uncomfortable. She shifted against the counter, her confident smile faltering. That's kind of morbid, Sophia. People die in rooms all the time. It doesn't make the rooms haunted or anything. Morbid. My husband's death was morbid. An inconvenience that made her uncomfortable. I thought about Marcus in his final weeks, worrying about me, making me promise I'd be okay. He'd known, somehow, that his death would reveal things about my family that I'd been too naive to see. He made me promise something, I said. Emma perked up, probably expecting some deathbed blessing for her to take over our room. What did he promise? That I wouldn't let anyone convince me our love was temporary, that I wouldn't let people treat his memory like it was disposable. I met her eyes directly, that I wouldn't let anyone make me feel ashamed for loving him even after he was gone. The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Emma looked away first, suddenly very interested in her milk glass. I'm not trying to make you feel bad, she said finally. It's just, life goes on, you know. Jake and I are starting a family. We need space for our future. Our future. As if my past was worthless. Something to be discarded so they could build their Pinterest-perfect nursery. I walked past her toward the hallway, still carrying Marcus's book. Sophia, she called after me. I hope you know this isn't personal. We just need to think practically. I stopped and turned back to her. Everything about love is personal, Emma. When you figure that out, maybe you'll understand what you took from me today. I went back to the sunroom, but not to sleep. Instead, I opened Marcus's laptop, which they'd somehow overlooked in their systematic erasure of his existence. His passwords were still saved, his bookmarks still intact. I started with his email, looking for anything they might have missed. That's when I found them. Emails from his college roommate David, who lived in Portland now. Messages about a job opening at the nonprofit where David worked, a victims advocacy organization. Marcus had forwarded the listing to me 2 weeks before he died, with a note. This sounds perfect for you. They need someone who understands loss. I'd never responded to it. I'd been too focused on his care, too overwhelmed with medical appointments and insurance calls, and the daily reality of watching someone you love slip away. But the job was still posted on their website, still open. By dawn, I'd crafted a cover letter that was honest about my situation. I wrote about losing Marcus, about understanding grief from the inside, about wanting to help other people navigate the aftermath of tragedy. I attached my resume and hit send before I could lose my nerve. At 7 a.m, Jake stumbled into the kitchen while I was making coffee. He looked hungover and satisfied, probably from celebrating his acquisition of a real bedroom. Morning, sis. How'd you sleep in your new room? I didn't. He poured himself coffee, oblivious to my mood. It'll take some getting used to. Change is hard. But Emma's got some great ideas for making it more homey. She's thinking maybe some plants, some fairy lights. Very cozy. Cozy. Like I was a college freshman decorating my first dorm room instead of a widow who'd been displaced by his pregnant girlfriend. Jake, I said carefully. Do you remember Marcus at all? He looked genuinely surprised by the question. Of course I remember him. Nice guy. Quiet. Really into those weird books. Weird books? Philosophy and poetry were weird to you. Jake shrugged. Not my thing. I'm more of a practical person. Emma says I'm very grounded, very present-focused. She says dwelling on the past is toxic, Emma says. Everything came back to Emma and her pop psychology wisdom gleaned from Instagram influencers and self-help blogs. I wondered what Marcus would think of this conversation, this reduction of his entire existence to weird books and nice guy. He loved you, I said. He asked about you all the time, worried that you thought he was stealing your big sister away from you. For a moment, Jake's face softened. Really? Really? He wanted to take you fishing before he got too sick. He was planning to ask Dad to let him borrow the boat for a guy's weekend. Jake was quiet for a long moment, stirring his coffee absently. I didn't know that. There's a lot you didn't know about him, about us, about what we meant to each other. Look, Sophia, Jake's voice took on that defensive tone again. I know you loved him, but he's gone now, and I'm sorry about that. I really am. But Emma and I are here. We're alive. We're building something together. That has to count for something. Building something. over the grave of what Marcus and I had built, using the ruins of our life together as foundation stones for their future. My phone buzzed with an email notification. A response from the nonprofit in Portland, asking if I could schedule a phone interview for that afternoon. I stared at the message, feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Possibility. I got a job interview, I said. Jake looked up from his coffee. Here in town? Portland, Oregon. His face went through several expressions in quick succession. Surprise, concern, and then something that looked suspiciously like relief. That's pretty far away. Yes, it is. What kind of job? Victim advocacy. Helping people who've lost loved ones navigate the legal system, connect with resources, find their footing again. Jake nodded slowly. That sounds like it would be good for you. Using your experience and stuff. Using my experience. My husband's death as job qualification. But maybe that wasn't entirely wrong. Maybe Marcus had been preparing me for this, without either of us knowing it. All those months of fighting insurance companies, dealing with medical bureaucracy, learning to advocate for someone who was too weak to advocate for himself. When would you leave? Jake asked. If I get the job? As soon as possible. He was quiet for a moment, processing this. Mom and Dad are going to freak out. Probably. They'll say you're running away. Maybe I am. Jake studied my face like he was seeing me clearly for the first time in years. You're really going to do this? I'm really going to try. He nodded slowly. For what it's worth, I think Marcus would be proud of you. It was the first thing Jake had said about Marcus that felt real, that acknowledged him as a person rather than an inconvenience. I felt tears prick my eyes, but they weren't the bitter tears I'd been crying for months. These felt different. Cleaner. Thank you, I said. That means more than you know. The interview went well. Better than well. The director, a woman named Sarah, who'd lost her own spouse in a car accident 5 years earlier, understood immediately why I wanted the job. She offered it to me on the spot, along with relocation assistance and a starting date 2 weeks away. I didn't tell my parents about Portland until dinner that night. Emma had made lasagna, bustling around the kitchen like the hostess of her own home, while Mom praised her domestic skills. Dad was talking about converting the garage into a workshop, making space for Jake's tools now that he was settling down. I have an announcement, I said during a lull in their planning session. All 4 of them looked at me expectantly. Emma was glowing with pregnancy hormones and satisfaction. Jake looked nervous, and my parents were the patient expressions they'd perfected over the past months whenever I needed to share my feelings. I got a job. In Portland. I start in 2 weeks. The silence that followed was deafening. Mom's fork clattered against her plate. Dad set down his water glass with deliberate care. Emma looked confused, like she couldn't process why anyone would voluntarily leave such a perfect arrangement. Portland, Mom repeated slowly. As in Oregon, yes. That's across the country, Sophia. You don't know anyone there. You don't have anywhere to live. I'll figure it out. Dad cleared his throat. This seems very sudden, very impulsive. Are you sure you're thinking clearly? Thinking clearly. The refrain I'd been hearing for months, as if grief had somehow damaged my ability to make rational decisions, as if wanting to honor my husband's memory was a symptom of mental illness. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in months, I said. What kind of job? Emma asked. I mean, what are you qualified to do? The question stung because it revealed how little she thought of me, how completely she'd dismissed my education and experience. But it also clarified something important. I wasn't qualified to do much in their world, the world of practical concerns, and moving forward, and forgetting inconvenient truths. But I was uniquely qualified for this other world, the world of people who understood that love doesn't end with death. Victim advocacy, I said, helping people who've lost family members. That sounds depressing, Emma said with a little shudder. Why would you want to surround yourself with more sadness? Why indeed? Because sadness shared was different from sadness hidden. Because helping other people navigate grief might help me understand my own. Because Marcus had taught me that love was worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed hopeless. Because someone needs to, I said simply. Mom was shaking her head. This is a mistake, Sophia. You're running away instead of dealing with your problems. Portland won't magically make your grief disappear. I'm not trying to make it disappear. I'm trying to honor it. By wallowing in other people's misery? Dad's voice was sharp now, frustrated. By refusing to move forward with your life? Move forward. Always the same phrase. As if healing was a straight line and I was failing to walk it quickly enough. As if there was a finish line where Marcus would stop being dead and I would stop missing him. I am moving forward, I said, just not in the direction you want me to. Jake was quiet through all of this, cutting his lasagna into smaller and smaller pieces. Finally, he looked up. When do you leave? 2 weeks. I need to find an apartment, arrange for movers. Movers? Mom laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. What exactly are you planning to move? Your things fit in a few boxes. She was right, of course. They'd made sure of that. But what she didn't understand was that sometimes starting over meant starting with almost nothing. Sometimes the lightest load was the freest one. I'm taking Marcus's books, I said. The ones you put on display in the living room. And his laptop. And anything else of his you might have overlooked. Now wait just a minute, Dad started, but I cut him off. No, you wait. You disposed of his belongings without asking me. You gave away his clothes, his journal, his personal papers. You changed the locks while I was at his funeral, and moved another woman into the room where he died. You've spent the last 3 months treating my grief like a character flaw, and my marriage like it was some temporary phase 1 needed to get over. My voice was rising, months of suppressed anger finally finding its way out. But you don't get to decide what Marcus meant to me. You don't get to decide how long I'm allowed to love him. And you sure as hell don't get to decide what I do with the rest of my life. Emma was staring at me with wide eyes, probably seeing me as a real person for the first time, instead of just an obstacle to her perfect nursery plans. Jake was nodding slightly, and I realized he understood more than I'd given him credit for. You're our daughter, Mom said, her voice cracking. We love you. We want what's best for you. What's best for me is a family that doesn't treat my husband's death as an inconvenience. What's best for me is people who understand that some love is worth carrying forever, even when it's hard to watch. I stood up from the table, my legs steady for the first time in months. I'm going to Portland. I'm going to help other people who've lost everything figure out how to keep living. And I'm going to do it without apologizing for still loving my husband. 2 weeks later, I loaded my few remaining possessions into a rented U-Haul truck. Marcus's books filled 3 boxes. His laptop and the photos they'd missed took up another box. Everything else I owned fit in 2 suitcases. My parents stood on the porch, watching me load the truck, their faces carefully neutral. They'd stopped trying to talk me out of leaving after the first few days, once they realized my decision was final. Jake and Emma were inside, probably already planning how to use the sunroom for storage. Call when you get there, Mom said as I climbed into the truck. I will. And if you change your mind, if Portland doesn't work out, I know where to find you, but I wouldn't be back. As I drove away from the house where I'd grown up, where I'd brought Marcus home to meet my family, where he'd died surrounded by people who never really understood him, I felt something I hadn't felt since his diagnosis. I felt free. Portland welcomed me with gray skies and rain, weather that matched my mood perfectly. The apartment I'd found was small and simple, with room for one person and the memory of another. I unpacked Marcus's books first, arranging them on shelves where I could see them every day. His philosophy, his poetry, his marginalia that proved he'd lived and thought and loved. The job was harder than I'd expected, and more rewarding than I'd dared hope. Every day brought people who understood loss in ways my family never could. Widows and widowers, parents who'd lost children, siblings destroyed by sudden accidents. People who knew that grief wasn't something to get over, but something to carry forward with dignity. 6 months after moving to Portland, I got a text from Jake. A photo of their baby. A little girl with Emma's nose and Jake's chin. Beautiful and perfect, and innocent of all the pain that had brought her into the world. Her name is Sophia, the text said, after her aunt. I stared at the photo for a long time, this tiny person who would grow up in the room where Marcus died, who would never know what came before her. Part of me wanted to be angry about the name choice, the presumption that this gesture somehow made up for everything that had happened. But mostly I just felt sad for her, this little girl, who would be raised by people who thought love came with expiration dates. I texted back a simple congratulations and put my phone away. Outside my apartment window, Portland stretched out under its eternal clouds, full of people carrying their own losses, their own loves, their own complicated relationships with the past. That night, I opened Marcus's laptop and found a folder I'd never noticed before. Videos. Dozens of them, all dated from his final months. I clicked on the first one and his face filled the screen. Thin but smiling, eyes bright with the fever that came and went during treatment. "Hey, beautiful," he said to the camera. "If you're watching this, it means I'm gone, and you're trying to figure out what comes next." I paused the video, my heart racing. Another message from beyond, another gift he'd left me. But this time I was ready for it. This time I had space to receive it, space to honor it, space to let it guide me forward, without anyone telling me to hurry up and heal. I pressed play, and let my husband's voice fill my small apartment, my new life, my carefully constructed space for grief and love and memory. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the city clean for another day of carrying on, of finding meaning in loss, of loving people even after they're gone. Some loves are worth carrying forever, no matter who it inconveniences. Marcus had taught me that, Portland was teaching me how. 3 years later, I received a wedding invitation in the mail. Hannah and Kyle, my parents wrote in their careful script, were finally getting married. The ceremony would be in the backyard where they'd once burned my husband's letters. The reception in the same house where they'd locked me out on the day of his funeral. I didn't respond to the invitation. Instead, I sent a small potted plant to their new address with a note, "Wishing you growth." Let them interpret that however they wanted. My life in Portland had taken root in ways I never expected. The victim advocacy work led to a master's degree in social work, which led to running my own nonprofit for young widows. I'd helped hundreds of people navigate the aftermath of loss, each one teaching me something new about resilience and the many faces of grief. I never remarried, though I dated occasionally. Marcus had been right about our love being worth carrying forever. It didn't weigh me down anymore. Instead, it had become the foundation for everything else I built, the source of my ability to help others find their footing in the wreckage of their own losses. The small apartment had grown into a house with a garden, where I kept Marcus's books on prominent shelves and his photo on the mantle. New friends came for dinner and asked about him naturally, the way you ask about any important person in someone's life. His memory lived openly in my world now, honored rather than hidden. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if my family had chosen differently that day. If they'd waited, if they'd asked, if they'd understood that grief shared is grief lightened rather than grief doubled. But those were idle thoughts. Their choice had forced me to choose myself, to build a life that honored both my love and my loss. The locked door had become an open road, and I'd walked it all the way to freedom. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.